Hello, in this tutorial we're going to learn how to use SharePoint Designer to create an external content type for business connectivity services. Once we've opened up our team site in SharePoint Designer, we can click onto the External Content Types section of the navigation pane on the left-hand side. Once we've clicked onto that, we'll see any existing external content types that we have inside the metadata database. First of all, we're going to click onto New External Content Type, and we're going to provide a name for our external content type. And this is going to be an internal name, so I'm just going to make it descriptive to me as to what this is. So we'll call that custs_orders. Clicking onto the display name, this is the value that will show to every user when they're going to add web parts onto the page or to create external lists. So I'm just going to elaborate a little bit further and put the full name of the tables that I'm going to be connecting to. So sometimes the stored procedures or the views have very programmatic names, if you like, but using a display name, we can use that display name property to make more sense to the end user when they're configuring business connectivity services within their sites. We also have the namespace, which will keep this name unique. We have the version that will be automatically incremented each time we make a change to the external content type. And we also have the identifiers section, which we can't yet do anything with. I'll show you what that is for once we've created a connection to the database itself. Before we explain the office item type and the offline sync for external lists, we're going to first of all create a connection to a database. So where it says external system, we're going to click the link, and that will show me any existing connections that I've already created using SharePoint Designer. So you'll notice that I already have a connection to the Northwind database. However, let's remove that, and we're going to add a new connection. So we'll click onto the Add Connection button. Now you'll notice using SharePoint Designer that there are three things that we can connect to. We can connect to a .NET type, an SQL server, or a WCF service. The SQL server allows us to connect to any SQL server we like, as long as we know the name of the server and we can authenticate with that server. We'll then be able to query the tables and build an external content type around any object within it. The .NET type is basically allowing us to connect to an external content type that has been created using Visual Studio and compiled as a DLL. So that would allow us to build a connection to anything using Visual Studio, but we would need to write the code in order to do that. The WCF service allows us to connect to data that perhaps isn't on the same network. We need to connect to it remotely, but we can connect to dissimilar systems using WCF, again, as long as we've exposed that data appropriately so it can be consumed by our external content type. BCS MetaMan does allow you to connect to over 30 external data sources without having to write any code, and that's something that we'll be touching on later. For now, let's first of all select the SQL Server option. We'll provide a name. So this is the name of our SQL Server, and we'll also provide the database name that we're going to be connecting to as well, which is called Northwind, and we can also choose how we want to authenticate. Now this is basically how I'm going to authenticate here, so I can connect using the user's identity, or I can also connect using a Windows identity or a custom identity. And if I was using either of these options, it's relying on me to use the secure store, which is something again that we will explain later on in the video. We're going to first of all connect to the data source with the user's identity. Now bear in mind that this might not always work for you. If you're using Windows authentication and NTLM and your SQL server is on a remote machine to the SharePoint server, you're likely going to suffer from the double hop issue. And that double hop issue basically means that the security token from the user's browser that they're using to connect to SharePoint, that token cannot be passed again to the SQL Server database, and therefore you'll see an error message complaining that you're trying to connect to the database as an anonymous user. If you're in a development environment and you'll find that your SQL Server is on the same machine as SharePoint, then this is probably going to work fine, even if you use a Windows authentication with NTLM. However, once we port this into production, it could possibly fail because of that double hop issue. And that's one of the reasons why we might want to look at using the secure store in order to overcome that double hop issue, or you could use Kerberos authentication instead of NTLM. For now, we're going to connect using the user's identity since my SQL Server is on the same machine as the SharePoint server. And that has established the connection to the Northwind database for me. As I expand that Northwind database, you'll notice that I can see the tables, the views, and also any functions or stored procedures. We're going to connect directly to the table, which in some respects, depending on the size of your database, might not be a good practice. If you're connecting to tens of thousands of rows, then you may consider creating a stored procedure that's going to be more appropriate to the view that you want to create inside SharePoint. So in this example, we're going to connect to the customers table, so I'll basically select the customers table. Notice that you can expand that in order to be able to preview the columns that are returned from the customers table, and also you can identify which is the primary key. We're going to right click onto that table, and this would allow us to create different operations depending on what we want to do or achieve with the external content type. Now, in order to use an external list, you need to have at least a read item operation and also a read list operation. Programmatically, these are known as the finder and the specific finder. The finder method, otherwise known as the read list operation, is going to return all of the rows and all of the columns from that table. And we can build filters if we want to refine the results that are displayed. The read item method uses the identifier, in this case the customer ID, to be able to uniquely identify a single row. And that occurs when we click onto an item to edit it or to view it, or click onto that item from a search result, or select it using an external data column. So we require those first two. The other three are optional: the create, update, and delete. Now the create, update, and delete are specific to the external list. So this allows us to create items within inside the external list and write back to the underlying data source. The update allows us to update the data, and the delete operation allows us to delete items. We also have an association, and the association allows us to build a join between two tables. So for example, we could create a join between the customers table and the orders table, and that would allow us to use the related list web part. So when we click onto a customer, we're going to see the orders, in this case, that were created by that customer. And it also works in the search as well. So when we search on a customer, on the profile page, we'll also see any orders associated to that customer as well. Now we can just go ahead and create all operations. The create all operations is going to create everything for us apart from the association. So we'll click on to create all operations, and we'll step through this wizard, which is going to allow us to create the entity, the external content type, and these are the operations we're going to create. So first of all, we'll just click next. Notice that all of the different columns are selected, so they're the columns that we're going to include in our external content type, and there's some properties on the right hand side that we can set for each individual column. Now one to point out is the show in picker property, and you'll notice that that isn't selected by default. As we go through, it's blank for everything. Now using SharePoint Designer, if that is blank for every single column, then every single column will be included in the picker. And the picker is basically by using a external data column within inside a SharePoint list or library. It's the dialog box that displays that allows you to go through and select an item to store as metadata. So if I don't want to display every single column in the picker, then I need to go through and set that property. So I can show the company name in the picker. Perhaps the customer ID is sometimes also useful, and we can maybe show something like the country as well. So those columns will be shown inside the picker. We've also got some other refinements that we can set, such as we have the display name. So notice in here that the names don't have a space within them, so I could add a space in the display name column. So sometimes the underlying database has very programmatic looking names, so this allows us to have a friendly name that is displayed to the user. We've also got some other properties that we can set as well, such as we can make some columns read-only, we can also make them required, and so on. But SharePoint Designer does a pretty good job of picking up those properties that are set inside the underlying database. Now we also have the Office property as well, and this allows us to map through to one of the columns inside Microsoft Outlook. So if we wanted to pull this information into Microsoft Outlook, we perhaps map the company name column to the company name column in Outlook, and first name could be mapped to first name, last name to last name, and so on. Since I didn't set the Office type, then this is just showing as unmapped for the time being. Now there's also a timestamp field, and that's very useful for ensuring that our search index is faster to index the content when we're trying to search the content via SharePoint Enterprise. So by setting the timestamp field, this could be something like a date time where the record was last modified in something like Dynamics CRM. So that's useful within Dynamics CRM. We can see when a customer was last modified, but what Business Connectivity Services can use that for is to know that, well, this was last modified before the last index, and therefore I don't need to index it again, therefore improving the performance of the indexing of that content. So we'll now click Next. In here we can also add some filters, and some filters are recommended, as is pointed out in the Errors and Warnings section of the All Operations wizard. So we can click onto Add Filter Parameter. Now one of the types of filters that is recommended is a wildcard filter. So when we click onto the Click to Add link for a filter, we can provide the filter a name, and we can also choose the type of filter. And notice that we've got comparison filters, we have limit filters, page number filters, timestamp filters, and so on. So it's a timestamp filter that you will create for the indexing, as we already pointed out. What I want to set here is something called a limit filter. SharePoint will actually complain if we don't set a limit filter, and it allows us to keep the number of rows below the maximum number of rows that can be displayed inside an external list, which by default is 2000 and can be increased to 5000. That said, we can create multiple finder methods inside an external content type, each bringing back less than the 5000 limit. So we can build other filters such as wildcard filters and so on to bring that data down. So I'm creating a limit filter here. We'll call that limit, and we'll click onto OK, and we'll go through and set the value as 1000. So once we've done that, we can continue to add more filters if we want to, but I'm just going to click Finish at that stage. So now I've clicked Finish, I've got the methods created. So now that that is done, we're basically going to click onto the Save operation, and that will save my configuration to a SQL database, which is the managed metadata store inside SharePoint. So the next thing we can do is go into SharePoint, and whilst we're in SharePoint we can go through and test the data by creating something like an external list. So if we go to Site Contents, we can select Add an App, choose the external list template, provide a name, and select our external content type. So within the list of external content types, we will choose the Northwind customer orders, click onto OK, click onto the Create link, and notice we now have customers returned, and we can click onto that and we can view all of our data. And one of the things we can do is click onto this tilde icon, and notice that we can view, edit and delete data as well. So if we wanted to edit the item, we could do so, and I could make a change, maybe to the contact title, and we can click Save, and that will write that data back to the underlying database for me. And that's one of the nice things about Business Connectivity Services, is that this data isn't actually imported into SharePoint and thus overinflating the underlying database, the SharePoint content database. It's basically linking to that data and allowing us to view it in a well-performing manner with pagination and so on. Okay, many thanks.